If the Supreme Court of the United States decides that race-conscious affirmative action is unlawful in college admissions, Jim Crow-era segregation could be right around the corner. The U.S. Supreme Court is considering arguments against Harvard University and the University of North Carolina. The former is home to anti-affirmative action conservative group Students for Fair Admissions, which believes that the practice of affirmative action in higher education violates their rights and discriminates against Asian Americans. Students for Fair Admissions wishes to turn over decades of precedent in favor of more race-neutral diversity efforts. The concept of affirmative action reportedly began in 1935 to protect workers' rights and allow them to form and join workers' unions. But in 1961, President John Kennedy signed an executive order that expanded those protections to account for racial inequality and ensure applicants are employed and that employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. Reportedly, the civil rights movement and the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 helped push that concept into the realm of higher education. Ivy League admissions officials must have felt the pressure to break from segregationist ideology and level the playing field, allowing Black and brown students to take more assured steps along the pursuit of happiness. In 1969, the number of Black students enrolled at Harvard increased by 76%. At Columbia University, 130 Black students were offered admittance that year, compared to 58 the year before. That's a 224% increase. Students for Fair Admissions believes that affirmative action violates equal protection rights enshrined in the 14th Amendment. And Chief Justice John Roberts seems to agree with at least some of their arguments.
An African-American applicant, you're concerned about diversity of viewpoint. Let's say his viewpoints tend to be very close to, the white applicants. And yet, under your system, when he checks African-American, he gets a tip. He gets a benefit from that. Isn't that very stereotypical under the Harvard program?
I think it's first of all, it is simply not the case that every Black applicant gets a, quote, tip.
Well, so there's only a little racial discrimination in the case.
You're asking me to answer a question that assumes that Harvard is discriminating on the basis of race? No, I can't accept that.
Mr. Waxman, isn't that what the case is about?
Jim Crow laws and Black codes have excluded Black and brown people in the U.S. from equal protection ideology for decades. Legalized segregation by race was rampant across the country up until the Civil Rights Act was signed 58 years ago. My grandma has dinnerware older than that. Race-conscious affirmative action in higher education was meant to help rectify the injustices against Black and brown people by taking into account how their lived experiences shaped them. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson artfully frames this issue as a question of whose legacy is allowed to matter.
I want to know, based on how your rule would likely play out, why excluding consideration of race in a situation in which the person is not saying that his race is something that has impacted him in a negative way. He just wants to have it honored, just like the other person has their personal background, family story honored. Why is telling him no not an equal protection violation?
According to the New York Times, even with affirmative action in place, Black and Latinx students continue to be underrepresented in Ivy League freshman classes relative to their makeup in the U.S. population. Meanwhile, their white and Asian counterparts have been continuously overrepresented. Affirmative action is about equity, not pity. No one is stealing your spot. Black and brown students are earning their admission with hard work and tenacity. If the Supreme Court decides that race-conscious affirmative action in higher education is unlawful, they could be turning back the clock to Jim Crow-era segregation in the U.S. If it's decided that factoring in the lived experiences of people of color and the impact of a legacy of systemic racism on their lives is no longer relevant to the story presented in their college applications, what will stop these already predominantly white institutions from trending whiter and whiter until all other perspectives are eclipsed?